check it for everything from your own end. Then you can start at sharp at 5.
Sure, sir.
Nice note. I mean, there is just information. This is Shampa. Yes. This is an information that I just wanted to know if I want to switch off the live transcription from my.
Ma'am, you can try switch off. That's not an issue.
Because it becomes very difficult for me to concentrate. I can concentrate.
No, ma'am, you can switch off because it's a individual based, so you can switch off.
It's individual based, no, but I don't know how to do it.
We got 9 participants as of now.
No, sir. Actually, we have given YouTube link to the participants.
Okay.
Only fine. For special participants who are in need of special requirements, we have given. Okay. So that's where. So other participants are already there in YouTube.
Okay.
We have around 40 participants with us on YouTube.
Very good.
So we can start.
So they will be joining, sir. 5 o'clock exactly. Okay. They will be joining. So that won't be an issue.
So we can start now. It's 5.
Yeah. And please go ahead.
Sure, sir. A very warm welcome and good evening to everyone. On behalf of the GNLU Center for Disability Studies, I, Anant Agarwal, a 4th year student at GNLU and a center member, take this opportunity to welcome you all to the webinar on the draft National Policy for Persons with Disability 2021, Expectations, Assurances and Realities, organized by the Gujarat National Law University Center for Disability Studies. This webinar aims to discuss on the aspect of the draft National Policy for Persons with Disability released by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. The revision in the National Disability Policy was long overdue and comes 16 years after the first National Policy for Persons with Disability in 2006. The draft policy expands the causes of disability and it includes malnourishment, medical negligence, socio-cultural factors, and impairment caused by disasters. It makes an important observation, stating that 1/3 of most disabilities in children are preventable if detected early. The draft policy also calls for a comprehensive national program on prevention that would include the disabilities added in the RPWD Act and other medical conditions that could manifest as a disability. This webinar is an effort to understand and critically analyze the draft policies through the views of renowned academicians and policy researchers. I would now like to highlight certain rules for the smooth conduct of this webinar. First, I would request participants to not chat unnecessarily in the chat box, as it would hamper the experience of the visually impaired individuals who employ a screen reading software. Secondly, I request all participants to keep their videos switched off to ensure that hearing impaired individuals are able to navigate to our sign interpreters with ease. I request all our hearing impaired participants to kindly pin the video of Miss Nitika ma'am and Miss Preeti ma'am to access the sign interpretation. You can also switch on the caption settings below to view the automatic subtitles of the speakers, which has been enabled for this webinar. We are also live streaming this webinar on YouTube to enable maximum participation, and you can join us from YouTube as well. There is a special request to the resource persons to kindly keep their camera close to their faces in order to enable our hearing impaired participants to observe their lip movements for better understanding. It is now my privilege to invite Dr. Marisport sir, Center Head of the GNLU Center for Disability Studies, for introducing the webinar and taking it forward.
Thank you, Anand. Yeah, thank you, Anand. I welcome you all for this webinar on draft policy on disabilities 2022. Here, before I give my address. Actually, on behalf of my director and registrar and GNLU, I welcome you all for this event, and I thank all the resource person from Shampa ma'am, Muralidharan sir, Padmini ma'am, and Rahul. He will be joining in the later part of this webinar, for their kind support and for kind enthusiastic participation for this event. And on behalf of GNLU and director, I would encourage to actively involve in this consultation process. In fact, director I told that he would be happy if we deliberated wisely and we give our constructive feedback to the ministry, which is the requirement of this policy mandate, right? And he also assured that these comments will be reach the ministry, and we will get it as much as the support which we want, right? So this is the assurance which we got it from our institution. And this webinar we actually arranged for two purposes, because this entire week we might have seen a lot of consultation on this draft national policies, but there are some population, they might not even read these policies. In fact, Muralidharan sir is able to highlight. In fact, he is fighting for the increasing the deadline for the submission of comments. He would be able to explain how much difficult to make the draft accessible to certain section of disabilities, right? And some people even may not be aware this consultation is happening. So keep that in mind. The first object of this policy, make some key aspects to be known in accessible manner and simple language to the audience. And second, we will get their views along with our discourse. So keep these two objects in mind. We have arranged this particular webinar, and experts, they will discuss what the policy contain and what are the further expectation changes also there. And I request audience, you also to look upon it, and you also give your inputs as well, and we can jointly together submit our recommendations to the government and hope to have a full-fledged comprehensive policy which will help our disability communities. With this, I once again welcome you all for this webinar, and I ask Anand to continue with the sessions. Over to you, Anand.
Thank you so much, sir. You highlighted the importance of being aware regarding the policy and our duty to participate in providing inputs and suggestions. Moving to the first address of this session, I would now invite Mr. Muralidharan Vishwanath sir. Muralidharan sir is the General Secretary of the National Platform for the Rights of the Disabled, which is an affiliating body of state-level cross-disability organizations with a membership of over 3 lakhs. He also contributes regularly on disability issues to various journals and newspapers, and was part of the civil society organizations delegation that participated in the CPRD committee's meeting at Geneva in 2019. Muralidharan sir will be speaking on the general aspects of the policy and disability certification under the draft policy. Over to you, sir.
Thanks to the university, Mary Sport, and Anand for actually the introduction that has been given. Is my video on, please? I'm just not able to see myself. I'm not sure whether others are able to see me. Yes, I think so. See, I'll just, since Mary Sport actually asked me to speak on first on the access issues and the deadline, I would like to inform all participants who are participating in the seminar that the deadline has actually been extended up to July 15. Actually, the initial deadline was July 9 for submission of the cover comments and suggestions. Now it has been extended up to July 15. So a week's, around 6 days time more has been given to us to actually respond to a week's time has been given to us to respond to the draft. So which is welcome actually. Initially, we had actually asked time for at least a month's time to actually go. Since it's a huge document, it covers various issues that are there before the disabled community, and there are various lapses to it. So we are actually asked for it so that we can hold consultations at various levels actually. This not is it's not a policy document which needs to be discussed about some people sitting in Delhi or some capitals in the country, but it needs to be disseminated to the ground below, so that the people at the grassroots can understand the policy actually. In fact, very regrettable is the fact that this policy document is not accessible for many disabled people. This policy document is language wise also, it's just available in English only. It's not available in other regional vernacular languages. So that is the biggest challenge that we are facing, as even with other government documents also. There's the same case. But there are limitations to which people from the ground below can actually talk about these issues and discuss about this. Having said that, now we're going to the draft document proper actually. See, one thing is that the draft coming about, the government talking about a policy is actually welcomed actually. This is as the initial speaker said in the introduction, that this has come 16 years after 2006 policy that was put in place. So 16 years after the policy came in, and 15 years after the UNCRPD was came into force actually, we have now come about with this policy document. It is welcome in that sense, but what would we have expected from a policy actually? There are various shortcomings as far as this document is concerned. One, what would we expect from the policy? The policy, what we would say is that the policy should lay down the historical perspective in which disabilities are being discussed, the current socio cultural, economic scenario, the political scenario, and all this accompanied by data, actually, data of disabled persons. That is actually missing in this. We normally, all of us say that there is no data as far as disabled people are concerned. This document does talk about getting those data actually, but that is not there in this document. The vision, then we should also have a vision and mission statement. It is there partially in this document, but it does not contain, we don't think there is a sincere effort in that direction that has actually come about in this. Much of it, I would say, is actually taken from the UNCRPD to the RPD Act. It's a policy document would actually say, should enunciate what the government proposes to do much beyond what is already contained in the Act, actually. What is already contained in various schemes, which should not be a reiteration of what already exists. Actually, what new you propose to do is actually needs to be contained. Implementation of RPD Act is one thing. I'm not saying that RPD Act should not. Unfortunately, that is not happening. That's a different matter. So, a full-fledged review of what was happening earlier, a full-fledged review of what had happened earlier, what was the fallacies and what are the failures of the earlier programs, etc., should have been there, and what are the issues before us, how they need to be addressed, what are the solutions that we propose to make. All those should actually, and actually this all should be accompanied by timelines. Actually, there are no timelines actually as far as I have gone through the document. I didn't see any timeline that is attached to this will be implemented within this date. This is a target that you're setting. This will be implemented within this date. So that is not there. And most importantly, however pious our wishes may be, there should be budgetary allocations for that. All the programs that we have seen that we announced earlier also, even the Accessible India campaign that was announced in 2015 with much fanfare, and actually was piloted by the Prime Minister himself. That program is also has not been able to achieve the targets that the program itself set. It's not a target set by civil society organizations or others in the field. It is set the government's own targets. They've not been able to meet the targets precisely because budgetary allocations have not been there. So all these components should have been part of the policy document, which I find is missing. Another thing that we're missing, you see, the policy document actually talks about the connection between poverty and disability. We all of us acknowledge that, and it's a good thing that the policy actually acknowledges that fact. But is there what does it come about as a solution of elevating poverty? Unless poverty violation is taken place, disability, most of the disabled people actually come from poor economic backgrounds. Actually, that is one thing. And disability actually accentuates poverty. This is something that we all of us recognize, because disability is an additional burden that disability actually imposes on us. It imposes on society. So that connection, how do we actually address that thing, is actually not clear, or it's missing from this document. Another aspect that is missing is, you see, when we talk about disability, it's not just about RPD and UNCRPD. We had laws before, we had various other laws also, we have various other laws also, like we have the RCI is there, we have the National Trust is there, and we also have mental health care for that matter. There is a cursory reference to the Mental Health Care Act in this. It does not go beyond that. Whether the government is actually, when you're saying you harmonize laws in accordance with the UNCRPD, whether and in the context of the coming into force RPD Act also, is the government taking any measures, proposing any measures to amend the RCA to align with the UNCRPD or the RPD Act? Is the government taking any measures to align the National Trust Act with this? There is no proposal, that there is no vision that I find in this track policy. So all these things are also, we need to keep these things also in mind when we are talking. The Healthcare Act is there. Now, another thing that has actually come about is that there is a separate healthcare accessibility policy that is being discussed now. The deadline was July 2 actually for submission of recommendations to that, comments and recommendations there. That could actually have been part of this policy. Why you need a separate healthcare accessibility policy for the disabled when you're discussing a disability policy? This should be a whole policy which would address all issues that are disabled are concerned. That is what a policy, national policy should be. You can't discuss piecemeal. This shows that in the government itself, various departments are not actually aligned or working together with a single aim or single goal. That gap that is there also needs to be addressed somehow. As I said, there are it's not a question about amending or fine-tuning RC and NT Act alone. So there are 90 laws that discriminate against people with disabilities. Most of them are state laws, actually, in matters of elections, in matters of taking up, being office bearers of various organizations, cooperatives, and various elected bodies and things like that. So that those acts and policies, actually, that are the 90 acts are there. Actually, many of them, there were 108 at one point of time. Many of them have been repealed. But now, or amended, actually. Now these also need to be amended. This draft doesn't actually talk about that. Talk about, especially in context of people with affected by leprosy. Then other legislations also, whether you need to streamline other legislations in consonance with UNCRPD or the RPD Act, there is no talk about it. And you might be knowing about the UN committee, actually, CRPD committee had recommended, and this was one of the things that actually we had been from the NPRD had been consistently saying since we were founded in 2010 about amending the constitution to include disability as a ground for as a ground on which discrimination is prohibited. Disability. We have Article 14, 15, 16 talks of other grounds like sex. It talks about language. It talks about religion, region, various other things, but disability is not included. So we have actually been campaigning for this, and the private members bill was actually moved in 2010 by Mrs. Brinda Karat, who was Rajya Sabha member at that point of time. Another bill has been now being introduced by John Brittas. Actually, he's being introduced. It has been this thing. When it will become, I don't know, but he has actually placed the bill for introduction on the same lines, rather, for amending Article 14, 15, 16 to include disability as ground on which discrimination is prohibited. So these things should have found place in a document, in such a document which lays the vision and mission for the future. Unfortunately, that is missing. Also, in this context, when talking about laws and policies, we also need to understand that RPD Act also is an anti-discriminatory legislation for the. And when this bill was being discussed, also we had raised the issue of section 3.3, actually, section 3, subclause 3, which subsection 3, which says that a person with disability can be discriminated against if it is to achieve a legitimate aid. And that was what was said earlier. Now it says the proportionate means to achieve a legitimate aid, something like that. I'm not, but let us say that. So it legitimizes discrimination. So we have said that this clause should be removed. That is not contained in this act. The same even other way. Another thing is that all of you know that we have a case pending in the Supreme Court on the matter of exemptions that have been given from various services, central paramilitary, central police forces actually, the Delhi police, the Dynates, and various other forces actually. So that also we are actually asked that exemption, that is clause that is there in the act actually, that should be removed. This act, this policy document does not talk about anything that the government proposes to do to end this discrimination and amend this act also, and various other clauses are also there. I'm not going to enter detail. I'm just saying the issues that have been debated have come to the fore. That thing is there. That also another thing that many of you know that we have been, ever since the term Divyang actually came into being, actually we have been consistently opposing this in wherever the word has been issued. We are saying this is a patronizing term. This is a regressive term indicating person with disability, connoting person with disability. It should not be used. We have been advocating for the usage of an what the UN has UN uses the term, and what has been internationally accepted as persons with disability or disabled persons. So these things should have been actually there. So we would actually say that highlight what are the issues that are there, decide on priorities, and based on that priorities, make the budgetary allocation, the human resources, and set the timelines for achieving each of these specific targets. You can't achieve all of them together. So separate sort of separate issues need to be identified and prioritized for implementation. As far as certification is concerned, I'll just go 1 to 3 issues. I'll just point it out. Certification, you see, one of the main issues that we have been actually talking about for all entitlements that the government gives under various schemes and policies, actually, you need a certificate for that. Unless you're certified as disabled, you're not entitled to any benefit. And also, even for lodge a complaint under the Act, also you need a certificate. You have to show your disability certificate. Unless that, you're not done. Certification in this country has been very poor. It is only around 50%. These figures that come from the department's annual reports that they submit to Parliament. So around 50% of disabled people identified by the 2011 census. 50% doesn't mean 50% of the disabled population. The population that was identified by the 2011 census. There are many years have passed after the census. That is one thing. Not many people were identified by the census. That is another thing. Now 21 categories are now part of it. At that point of time, there were only 7 categories or 7 disabling conditions that were recognized. Now you have 21 conditions that are recognized, and it is a huge task. This document does talk about having mobile units to actually go, and good thing. The camps were also conducted earlier also, but much more needs to be done. Problem is not about having camps alone. Problem is there are various hurdles in hospitals that are created when a person with disability goes. Of course, one thing that is welcome here is that they are saying that only 2, not more than 2 visits a disabled person will have to go to a hospital to get a certificate. That is welcome. But at the same time, the certification, this document says that both offline and online mode would be put in place, but it ignores the fact that on June 1, 2021, actually, the government notified saying that everything will be mandatory online now. So there's a contradictory thing. So in many places, like in Delhi and maybe various other states, I know it has been mandatory now online. And this document also acknowledges the fact that internet connectivity, electricity is poor, internet connectivity is poor, but how are these people going to get this thing online? So more people will be deprived of certification if you try to impose this online method. One. Second thing about education, actually, many things are said about it, but the thrust, it talks about implementation of the new education policy 2020. See, one thing we need to understand, as opposed to 2019 draft, the 2019 draft actually did not contain anything about inclusive education. It did not talk about the RPD Act. It did not take cognizance of the RPD Act, in fact. But after a UN cry was raised, after many people petitioned, after various submissions were made, finally, when the final document was adopted in 2020, NEP talked about inclusion, various things. It talked RPD Act, it recognizes the RPD Act, and various things about it. But we need to understand that the basic thrust of the NEP is actually commercialization. Once commercialization happens, the marginalized are going to be left out of schooling. Let us be very clear about it. Second thing is the NEP advocates closure of neighborhood schools. The NEP advocates creating big school complexes. Let us be very clear. Most of disabled persons who come from rural areas or poor economic backgrounds, they are able to go to school because there is a school in the neighborhood, especially girl students actually. Once this is got written off and encouraged, private schools are encouraged, can be damn sure that many of the disabled persons will be out of the schooling itself. So now what is the other proposal that they're making? The proposal is of home-based learning. The proposal is of online education. I need not talk about it because all of you have experienced what online education is during this period. Of course, the COVID was a compulsion. That's a different matter. But those compulsions cannot be turned into a regular feature. So, and also about education, you see, all the special schools that were there, actually, special schools continue to remain under the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. There is no proposal to shift it to the Ministry of Education. Ideally, it should be the Ministry of Education. This document also does not talk about it. Unfortunately, and more this thing serious is the fact that there is not a line on higher education in this document, which is entirely missing in this document on talk of higher education. That, as far as I could understand, there are myriad problems actually that are there in the field of higher education, access to education, access in the campuses, various issues are there. I'm not going to all those details. Second, another thing actually is about employment actually. See, it does talk about implementation, various proposals are there, etc. But we cannot be, we cannot ignore or see what is actually happening in the country today, because reservation is limited to government sector, PSUs, etc. It is not there in the private sector. The private sector is very reluctant, even otherwise, to employ disabled people. There is a lot of this thing happening now. Privatization is happening, contract labor is casualization is happening in various jobs in the government sector itself. In all these things, actually, no reservation is there. So that is one thing. So there is a need to revisit this policy actually, and we also need to. In 2012-13 budget, the then Finance Minister P. Chidambaram had actually announced incentives. This document also talks about incentives. The RPD Act also talk about incentives. Incentives were announced earlier also, but there were very few takers for that. Even now, that sort of incentives is not going to work. We need to actually talk about disincentives actually. It can be in the form of additional sales. There is a threshold of 20 or 30 employees that are there. About that, if you're recruiting one person, it has to be a disabled person. If you don't employ that person, you have to pay an additional cess. This would be the amount of, it should be a penal sort of thing. This is not something novel thing that I'm suggesting. This is there in France, this is there in Germany, there's various other EU countries, various different sorts of plans are there that compel the private sector to employ disabled. Without that, it is not going to happen. Let us be very clear about that. On this, there is a social security aspect also, which I'm not going too much detail, but social security it does not cover too much in this document. Unfortunately, the mandates of the RPD are not being this thing that talks about caregiver allowance. It talks about priority in housing. It talks about, especially for women, these things are not even mentioned in this document, unfortunately. But all pious declaration, as I said earlier at the beginning, actually have to be backed by budgetary allocations, which this document does make a reference to absolute allocations that are there. It does candidly admit that budget allocation was only around 0.0039% of GDP. And this is a quote from the document. It's not my this. They are saying that only 0.0039% has been allocated for persons with disabilities, but it doesn't come up with a solution or doesn't come up with a proposal asking for enhanced spending. So what is the meaning of making a mere statement of fact? You need to actually say what would be the allocation that you would make, and we would ideally demand that at least 5% of the GDP should be allocated for person. You would say it's a tall order. Yes, it's a tall order, but we need to substantially increase step by step, year by year, to reach that 5% is not an unachievable target, but we need to go towards this. Again, even if I have a policy document with all that I had said also, implementation would be a huge challenge. So we will have to be constantly vigilant to see that it is implemented. Like in the RPD also, we have to constantly keep on pressurizing the government, both the center and the states, to see that its provisions are implemented. Of course, I presume that all of us will work together on this draft policy document also. We have had one consultation at the national level. We are thinking, we are involving various other people. We have asked for suggestions from various people, and we are now in the process of drafting our comments to the draft national policy, and we'll be submitting that in a few days. And it's actually good that though the government did not, the department did not agree for a month's extension, it has at least advanced it by a week, extended it by a week. So that would be a good thing. I hope this consultation would actually lead to much more fruitful, and in getting more opinions and things, and making this draft much more stronger in the interest of the disabled people of the country. Thank you very much once again for inviting me and to participate in this consultation.
Thank you very much for your comments and suggestions, sir. There are a couple of questions we have received through the YouTube live stream chat. I'll take Mr. Samir Bhaduri's question first. He's asking regarding the postdoctoral fellowship. If we see the UGC website, then postdoctoral fellowship for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and women have been prescribed, but there is no fellowship for a researcher who is a person with disability. So your comments or thoughts on the same?
No, there are. I'm blissfully unaware of that. I have no hesitation saying that. But we need, if there is no policy on that, we need to actually advocate for that. But as far as my knowledge goes, I think there is some scholarship schemes actually. Students in JNU have been availing of that. That is my understanding. I would stand corrected if somebody points me out, but we need to explore that possibility, and we need to advocate for that. If it is not there, we'll surely do that.
Right, sir. Thank you. A second question is by Mr. Umesh, who says that not a single word on disability people's organizations or DPOs in the empowerment chapter has been prescribed. He says that capacity building and empowerment of DPOs must also be included in the policy framework, and is asking for your thoughts on the same.
Yes, Umesh is very right, actually. Very valid comment that he has made. Actually, there is no recognition of DPOs or activists actually, and this has been actually a drawback, not only with this policy document. You mean in various other things also. The government has been reluctant to consider. Reluctant to consult DPOs actually on various issues. RPD Act actually mandates that disabled persons organization should be consulted on all major policy issues, but it is not being done. It's not being implemented. So your point is valid. It needs. We'll definitely see that it's incorporated in our comments.
Thank you, sir. The last question is also by Mr. Umesh Purohit. He comments that the policy has not given any timeline for a self-review or monitoring mechanism in the policy itself. And considering that the policy has come after 16 years, do you feel that any monitoring mechanism should have been incorporated in the policy?
See, we are actually, I didn't go to all the comments that we're going to make actually. If you write down all the comments, all that we have in mind, actually, it will be much bigger than the document draft policy itself. That's the difference. But your comment is valid actually. We are asking for monitoring mechanism actually. In fact, our comment, one of the main demands that we're making is that monetary mechanism should be there. Also, the issue of what is say audits, social audits also should be a component of the policy, where each scheme is actually evaluated, audited. Various other measures and policies are also evaluated, and this thing that is one of the issues that actually we are raising in this thing. Apart from monitoring mechanisms, what else did you say, Umesh?
Sir, regarding self-review.
Yes, self-review. Actually, that's another point. Actually, there is no timeline is set for this in this also. Actually, that's a correct point, because we didn't have a policy after 2006, and that policy did talk about periodic review. Actually, that policy did talk about periodic review, but which didn't happen actually. And in this case also, even if it talks about periodic review or a set timeline, is that going to happen? Is a big question. Anyhow, it's a valid thing that you said, but we'll definitely put that in our comments.
Thank you so much for your address and also for answering all our questions, sir. We now move to our second speaker, Ms. Shampa Sen Gupta. She is a Kolkata-based activist working on gender and disability issues for more than 3 decades. She is the founder of the advocacy group Shruti Disability Rights Center and is joint secretary of the National Platform for Rights of the Disabled. She has been at the forefront of multiple disability awareness programs and policy initiatives. We thank you, ma'am, for the support of the Shruti Disability Rights Center in organizing this webinar, and we humbly invite you for your address.
Thank you so much. Thank you, GNLU, for organizing this webinar. As Marisport has already said, that there are many consultations going on at national level at different levels on this draft policy. But we also need to, we thought of organizing one more webinar, because we felt that as many consultations happen, as many people we can reach out to with a draft policy, it is very important that we should reach out to as many people. We should try to explain what is there in the draft and get feedback of different kinds of stakeholders. Unfortunately, our government didn't give us any accessible version of the draft policy. It is not available in ISL, Indian Sign Language. It is not available in any other language other than English. So we are trying to organize different kinds of meetings, smaller group meetings, where we are talking in local languages and get feedback. And I'd like to say that since I've been working on the intersection of gender and disability, this is really a very big setback, this draft. Because even in 2006, prior to UN's adoption of the CRPD, even when the convention was not adopted by the UN, 2006, we had our first national disability policy. And we saw that there was a separate chapter on women in that policy, chapter 3. And now we have, after 16 years, we have the UN adopted the CRPD, India signed and ratified the CRPD. We changed our, we not only amended, we changed, we got a totally new law. We just junked the 1995 Act and have a new, totally new law. We have our RPD Act now, where we, with the mention of women with disabilities. And it's very, very strange that I find that we do not have any chapter on women with disabilities in this new draft. I'm just going back a little bit to understand what was there in the 2000s and what are we missing. Are we really missing something that the older one, that this doesn't include women with disabilities? It's very interesting because in the 2006 policy, it talked about programs will be, I'm just reading out a little bit, programs will be undertaken to rehabilitate abandoned disabled women, girls, by encouraging their adoption in families, support to house them and impart them training for gainful employment skills. The government will encourage the projects where representation of women with disabilities is ensured at least to the extent of 25% of total beneficiaries. Now, this is something which we know that even if though it was in the policy, it was not implemented for last 16 years, but it was there in the policy. Abundant disabled girls and women. And this is something we hear about almost every day. Almost every day, as organizations working in the sector, we get phone calls, we receive that people are abandoning disabled girls, disabled women are thrown out of their house on a regular basis. So this was mentioned in a 2006 document, and we are going backward. We are not including, the government is not including any issue, anything about them in this new draft. The older 2006 policy says steps shall be taken to provide short duration, short stay home for women with disabilities, hostels for working disabled women, and homes for aged disabled women. And exactly the demands that we are making now. The short stay home, we have short stay homes in our country. Women who face domestic violence have the right to go and stay in a short stay home. Suppose there is a problem in marital family, prior to going to anywhere else, she may not get a job, she may not find shelter, she can go and stay in a government short stay home. And other women, non-disabled women, have the right and they have access to do a short stay home. But unfortunately, those short stay homes are not accessible for disabled women. So we need accessible short stay homes, and this is need of the day. Even during COVID period, there had been so many phone calls that we received, where disabled women asked that I cannot stay at home. There is so much torture I'm facing. I just need a shelter. And we couldn't, as organizations, we could find NGOs. Yeah, there are NGOs who are helping women with disabilities. We couldn't find any government shelter homes, short stay home, where you can stay for the maximum 3 months period is given for this, because this is a particular kind of home which is required by women who face domestic violence. It is also noted again from the 2006 policy, the government will take up a program to provide financial support to women with disabilities when they become mothers. And this is again, this has been implemented in the railways. The Railway Employees Union took up this point from the policy and it is implemented. So railways is a place where most of the we have the majority of our employment comes, and people actually they could implement this part of the policy. Now, this will again be not remain in the policy once the new policy is adopted, because it's not mentioned here. I think it is an extremely sad development for people who are working on um, people like us on the intersection of women with disabilities. We actually hoped that the twin track approach that CRPD2, where women had been included in both, in the general body and also had a separate chapter, that the twin, forget about twin track approach. There was no mention. There is there are mention of women with disabilities, but it's just done in an ad hoc basis. Somewhere and there, they have copied and pasted from the RTD Act. There is no mention of Article 6 of CRPD in this document, and that is something we definitely recommend, that Article 6 should be mentioned. It is very interesting because in its key principles, it says this policy recognizes that women and girls with disabilities are at greater risk and are prone to violence, abuse, and exploitation. If this is one of your key principles, if you understand that this is an important area, then how do you not include provisions to support them when they actually face violence or abuse? It's also very interesting because there is a speaker who will speak on sports here. And in the sports section, all of a sudden, there's a mention of women with disabilities. It says it is estimated that only 7% of women with disabilities are involved in sports globally. Therefore, by improving inclusion of PWDs, sports can help advance the sustainable development goals. So suddenly, one intersection, one mention of women with disabilities in the sports section is there. And there are quite a few areas which talks about women with disabilities, but those are like really totally copied and pasted from RTD Act. It doesn't give any new vision, any new way forward to us. It talks about protection from abuse, violence, and exploitation, executive magistrate to take cognizance of such complaints in this regard. So this is again copied from RPD Act. Reproductive rights, it talks about no person with disabilities to be the subject of any medical procedure which may lead to infertility without free and informed consent, which I think is a reproductive rights. It's very important to talk about reproductive rights, but you were just talking only about reproductive rights without talking about any sexuality education, any kind of information. Like you were talking about informed consent. In what kind of informed consent a person with disability can give if you do not give them any kind of sexuality education, any kind of training on sexuality and reproductive issues? It's very interesting because this clause in RPD Act and this new draft is gender neutral. And when you give such gender neutral clauses, one way it is good because you are actually including not only men and women, you're also including transgender people also. So, since India as a country now acknowledges that there are three genders, there are laws that acknowledge transgender. So it's good in one way, but it's also very important to understand that women with disabilities face particularly different kinds of issues while accessing reproductive rights. So those issues are not included in this draft. It talks about legal capacity, persons with disabilities who have right to inherit property, control their financial affairs, have access to bank loans, etc., etc. This is something very interesting, as Muralidharan has already mentioned in my previous presenter. If you do not amend the National Trust Act, the legal, because legal capacity, the issue of legal capacity becomes very vague, because now you want, at the same point you were saying that every disabled person will have same legal capacity. and in the National Trust Act, where guardianship model is very much in process. So you need to we need to bring our own laws at same par, at same understanding, and that is we are not getting any new way forward from this draft. It doesn't talk about changes in National Trust Act required. It doesn't talk about much changes in the RTI Act required, and it hardly, barely talks about Mental Health Care Act, which is very, very sad. Uh, Again, from RPD Act, the total punishment chapter, the chapter from of punishment is totally copied and pasted in this draft. It talks about punishment for offenses of atrocities, humiliate a PWD within public view, assault or use force to any PWD with intent to dishonor him or outrage the modesty. So all those issues, the same thing, exactly like it's just copied and pasted. We are not getting any new thing from here. I mean, we should actually, the policy should have told us how we can implement. I mean, the way forward that are those clauses of RPD. It doesn't say anything. Uh, Conducting medical procedure on a woman with disability leading to termination of pregnancy without her express consent. All this just taken. The whole punishment clause of RPD Act is copied here. As and for people like us, what we suggest is uh, there is already recommendations there. It's not that after the RPD in 2016 passed, post that there had been, I think there were more than 60 organizations, DPOs, which came together, and when people like us, we worked together to form a document which was presented to the CRPD committee in Geneva. And CRPD committee, after reading our presentation, the alternate report, gave a very, very specific feedback to the Indian government, how to improve our laws, how to implement, how to make changes, and there had been substantive recommendations from the CRPD committee to the Indian government, and we have it documented. It's in the CRPD website. So I mean, like we don't want to. I mean, for me, I don't want to sit and write a totally new recommendations right now. I personally feel that we need to include. There had been recommendations on particularly on chapter Article 6 of CRPD. Article 6, as we all know, is a article on women with disabilities, and it says that the committee is concerned about multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination faced by women and girls with disabilities. So it starts with that and says adopt national and state action plans for promoting equality and the inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in all areas of life. Ensure that the national policy for women mainstreams disability and ensure the effectiveness of campaign to raise awareness, reduce stigma, gender and disability stereotypes involving women with disabilities through their representative organizations in awareness raising programs following the committee's general comments. Establish gender responsive policies and budget allocations at the national and state levels to address the rights of all women and girls with disabilities. And this is something very important. You need to have gender responsive budget allocations uh, and policies to address the rights of all women and girls with disabilities, irrespective of impairment, rural or urban, location, ethnic identity, social or economic background, and collect data disaggregated by sex, age, ethnic, religious background to better inform policy. And this is something we had been demanding, and this is a demand from the grassroots for many, many years. We had been demanding that there should be disaggregated data We do not have, for example, NCRB, the National Crime Records Bureau, till now do not keep data on women with disabilities. How many women face violence every year? The National Crime Records Bureau keep records of violence of all women in general and other marginalized identities, like Dalit, uh, like religious minorities. But regarding disabled women, we do not have any data from National Crime Records Bureau. And this is something the UNCRPD, the CRPD committee also suggested to the Indian government. And these are the issues, these are the same recommendations that we want to include in our recommendation to the government. It also says that ensure full and effective participation of women with disabilities in decision and policy making at all levels, including policies adopted by Ministry of Women and Child Development, National Commission for Women, and State Women's Commission. So these are the some things which are already written, very well articulated recommendations are there. I'll just finish my speech by uh, discussion by talking a little bit about access to justice, because we all know that women with disabilities, they are more vulnerable to violence, and we need uh, and there are very very few cases where women and girls with disabilities actually get their justice, even if they can lodge a complaint. When they lodge a complaint, I mean, lodging a complaint, that is itself is a difficult process. So even in in very recent times, just 3 months ago, there was a case of a gang rape where a girl, a young woman who tried to, she was just shunted from one police station to other because they couldn't understand what she was saying. Instead of calling a sign language interpreter or a special educator, which is already in the law, which the Criminal Law Amendment Act already says that this is the need, something, uh, this is a need of a woman with disability when she faces such kind of violence, but the police didn't call. So, and this is something it's happened in my city, and it's happening everywhere in India, because police not there is very little awareness also about the Criminal Law Amendment Act itself. So, so this is something. So, article access to justice is something. Also, we have very specific recommendations that you have to make accommodations for people with disabilities, so that they can access court buildings, accessible information, sign language interpretation, and sufficient legal aid. The gender stereotyping and prejudices in the justice system needs to be addressed, keeping in mind the disability aspects. So this is something which we look forward to. We'll definitely write to the ministry, and I hope that the other organizations who are sending their recommendations will also include the issue of women with disabilities in their recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. We have a question from Mr. Arnab Kumar Bhattacharya. He says that the RPWD Act is not implemented yet, and the census has not been done after 2011, and hence the data regarding the population of the persons with disability community is still not accurately available. And do you think the government will consider our recommendations wholeheartedly? Is there any specific rule to amend a policy at a regular interval?
Thank you, Arnab, for the question. For implementation of any law and policy, we just have to, we people who are consider themselves a civil society, uh, have to keep on harping to the government. We just cannot let the government go away with it. It's unfortunately that even the 1995 Act was not properly implemented. But there have been a lot of cases filed and things were moving. I'm not saying that there has been no change at all. Even after 2016, Act. One of the major problems that we faced is, of course, COVID, because there have been almost 2 years. Many of us couldn't really do as much as we wanted to. I mean, it's not just we have to sit at home, and many of us fell ill and faced trauma. It was a traumatic experience for the pandemic. And but if we just keep silent, if we don't demand, a civil society organization, if we keep mum, then of course the government will not look at our demands. Yes, we don't have proper data, and that is also something we keep on having, and because that is a duty of the government also. We cannot say that it's that they count it, and it's like I said, that we have to, if required, you need to write to the government. If they're not listening to you, you have to go to the court. So there is a whole process of advocacy, and so it's not that there are many laws and policies which just remains in paper. But again, it's up to us that how much pressure we can create on government. And I feel it's very important that we need to keep our, now that things are moving a little faster than past 2 years of COVID, we need to work on it, all of us together.
Ma'am, we have a question from Mr. Salman Khan. He's asking regarding an explanation about the accountability of the executive magistrate and the fact that most of them are unaware about the provisions of the RPWD Act.
Again, it's RPD Act itself talks about that everyone responsible, like from the police to the magistrates, from the judiciary, everyone should be getting trained about disability issues. So we need to. I'm very much aware that the magistrates are not knowledgeable about disability issues at all. So it's also one of the reason that when I mean, I'm just, this is for like anecdotal this thing I'm saying, that when I go to the courts and talk to the lawyers or talk to any judge or anyone who's in any position there, they say we don't know about this law because you people don't bring us case. If there is only one or two cases on RPD Act in the Kolkata High Court. It's Calcutta High Court. So we also don't need to learn about it. So the disability community also have to fight a lot of. If you don't file cases, the lawyers don't feel like reading about it. The magistrate don't feel the need to know about it. So there are two ways of doing it. Of course, we need to put pressure on the government to say that disability training should be imparted to everyone, and also we take as much as cases as possible.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There's just one last question, although it is quite broad in nature. Miss Varsha Bariyar says that there are many disabled individuals in villages and rural areas which are not aware either of their constitutional rights or the rights under the RPD Act. So, what should the draft speak about such individuals?
Actually, majority of the disability population of India stay in rural areas. Uh, so, and they come from very poor family without much information about their rights. So again, I will send the ball to the government's court. In the draft, it should have been mentioned that disability awareness should be raised at all levels. So from panchayat level, you can start training from panchayat level where disability awareness should be done. And we have seen that, and there are demands that there is no, since there is nothing much about, not at all about anything about political participation of persons with disabilities. yet at panchayat level, it is very important that at panchayat level, this representation of disabled people should come. Since you're talking about rural people, the training should be starting from there, and this is something an important recommendations. I hope someone from GNLU is taking notes and keeping all the recommendations in their record. There will be some mention. That is something a recommendation will send to the government that this draft should include that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
We now move on to our next speaker. We have with us Dr. Padmini Chenna Pragada, ma'am. She is a Doctor of Philosophy in Adapted Physical Education and a Master of Science in Adapted Physical Activity from the Texas Women's University in the US. She is also a trained physiotherapist and has created and leads the Adapted Sports India movement, which was started as a social media campaign and is today an initiative which is a community-driven effort encouraging and educating Indians with disability to use sports as a tool for development to improve their quality of lives. Her independent work is focused on sports governance within India's disability sport federations and physical education in schools for children with disabilities in India. Through a rights-based approach, ma'am writes about the governance issues within India's disability sports world. She will be addressing this webinar on disability sports in the draft policy. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation, and we invite you for this session.
Thank you, Mr. Agarwal. I'm going to now start sharing a PDF. I have made about 6 to 7 slides to sort of summarize the complex nature of how sports, culture and recreation is being implemented within this draft policy. Keeping in line with what has been said as what you call it as the theme of this discussion, I have curtailed the topic into certain categories, that expectations, assurances, and realities. The discussion with regards to how the policy is addressing the sports and recreation aspect it requires a much elaborate deliberation. But considering the time here, I'm going to list few of the things that may remain in your focus as you as internally or as in smaller groups as law graduates or as professors, you're going to discuss further on this, until the inputs are closed by the government. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So if I'm going to do, is my screen visible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I can go ahead and use the slide, right?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, so this is the title slide, which is detailing my qualifications and full name. And see, when I say chapter 8, sports, culture and recreation, I'm talking particularly about a dedicated chapter inside the draft national policy for persons with disabilities 2021. And what must be understood is that like other chapters, as the earlier speakers have noted, even in this chapter, there has been text that has been copy pasted from the RPWD. But even before we go into deliberate on the chapter or the contents of the chapter, I would like to first talk about what I am going to structure my presentation as. That is, first is expectations from the community. What is the community of persons with disabilities expecting, with regards to chapter 8? And then assurances, what have been so far the assurances from the government in the context of sports. I'm not going to go too deep into culture and recreation because that sort of falls under the information and broadcasting ministry's purview. My focus today would mostly be involving two ministries and their work, which is the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports and the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. And then I am going to tell briefly about the realities, ground realities and the way forward. See, what needs to be understood first is that there is a there are a few frameworks that are essentially being employed when the chapter 8 of this draft is being put into the picture. And as a researcher, I can only see that these are the 3 relevant frameworks that are pertinent, to this topic. One that is least being discussed within most of the consultations is the presence of a National Sports Development Code in India, and the National Sports Development Code of India 2011 is a de facto, it's almost a sports law in India, because starting from the Supreme Court judgments to the High Court judgments at various state levels, this code is being used as a law. Even the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports, the Department of Sports, when becomes a party to one of the court cases, they are bringing in the NSDCI 2011 to court and to protect their decisions or their policy making. So all law graduates and law researchers who are going to be studying this topic need to understand that this code is your go-to document. Even though it is a decade old, it has not been updated, this is still the de facto law that is being followed by the courts and the lawyers for any sport related cases, for people with disabilities and for people without disabilities. The second is the RPWD Act, which is being referred multiple times by the earlier speakers too. And third is the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. See, the UNCRPD basically was the basic framework on which our RPWD Act 2016 was designed. But what we fail to understand is the detailed manner in which the UNCRPD was structured versus how the UNCRPD was used and was squished into a act we have, because India is such a diverse country, and when the act was formed based on the consultations that were made at that time, the act that has come out can be said to be fairly comprehensive. But what one must understand is, even if a fairly comprehensive act compared to its PWD Act 1995 was put in place, one must understand, referring to what Ms. Shampa was referring to about the rural population or the population that does not have access to higher amenities for information, we must understand that a majority of this community of persons with disabilities still resides in the last mile villages or the semi-urban or semi-rural communities in India. And when you are in a metro city and when you have a disability, your access to amenities and infrastructure is significantly different for somebody who is in a rural area. So when a policy like this is implemented into the community, it becomes the most essential go-to tool for the individuals at the grassroots. Why are people going to a law school to study law, to become lawyers? Because it is sort of an organized, structured science that is not easily understood by every common citizen in the country. So when policies like this are introduced, they almost become learning tools for people about their own rights. And we, as a community who's working from a rights-based approach, we are coming in from that philosophy when we either provide inputs to the government or want to engage in a dialogue as a stakeholder. Okay, on that note, I mean, I just want you to know that that is the tone I would like to set for where we are coming from or where I am coming from as a speaker on this topic. Then the next thing I would like to talk about are what are the expectations and wants from the community. So see, we don't, I as an individual, without being a part of the union or the government's machinery, do not have access to infrastructure where I can get you empirical data to say, we have visited this many citizens in this many states or districts, and this is the number of people, and this is how they are speaking. But largely from the anecdotal evidence we are able to gather from the support groups and the communities we are a part of, these are some of the points that have been going around in the community of persons with disabilities. First is the policy does not provide clarity. They want clarity on funds allocation for disability sport. And what listeners and audience must understand is disability sport is not just para sports. Disability sports has deaf sports, which leads to Deaf Olympics, which is sort of the Olympic level sport for deaf people. Then there is blind sports, which is a part of the Paralympics. But then there's also international blind world championships, blind sport world championships. Then we have Special Olympics, which is led by Special Olympics Bharat in India. And there is an exclusive national sport federation for individuals who have cerebral palsy. So with this kind of 4 types of disabilities being provided national sport federations at the central level, we must understand that there is no clarity on where the funds allocation is happening, because the fund allocation in India happens through this organization called Sports Authority of India. And so there is no clarity. So one of the expectations of the community is that they want clarity on what are the earmarked funds, or how much percentage of fund can be made available and what is it allocated for. So the policy document can elaborate on that point. Then what and who are the nodal agencies that will monitor the sport? See, there are national sport federations on which the government or the union has placed the responsibility, but these national sport federations are not being fully monitored. So the community also wants to know, what are my protections? If I am a person with disability, what are the protections and safeguards for protection I have as a person with disability to engage in sports? And then what are the pathways? So when I am going to open the chapter 8 with regards to sports, culture and recreation, I want to see what are my pathways as a person sitting in some rural Adilabad district of South India. I want to know what is the pathway that I should put on my wall every day to see, to be motivated to go to that podium and to be able to represent my country proudly. So in the last mile villages or from the places where the athletes with disabilities in India are coming, that clarity is not existing. So the dependency of citizens with disabilities on middlemen or the middle deal makers is increasing, and that is causing unnecessary burden on the citizens. So the government in the document must detail the pathways that specific people under each NSF can take to be able to make it to the podium. So that becomes a great learning tool. Then what are the sources of training and listed approved agencies? Because without such a approved list from the government, if you have the stamp of the government, the citizen is feeling more confident to say, I can go to this organization and my right will be protected. So the government can use this opportunity to definitely put a list of approved agencies or disabled people's organizations, which can be the point of contact at each state level. They do not even have to go to the district level. If this policy document can provide a comprehensive list of approved DPOs at the state level who can provide the information, or if this policy document can provide the guidelines for the DPOs to bridge that gap, a lot of the needs from this community can be met with regards to chapter 8. And then the next thing here is, what are the assurances from the government so far? And it became important for me to put together this information, because while this policy document is critically lacking in the way it has been put together, I would also like to recognize the fact that since 2014, there has been an increase in the public discourse with regards to sports, yoga, and physical education. And that's partly because of either the political will or the philosophy of the leadership at the central level. And I can certainly see that trickling down to the grassroots, and the adoption of that culture at the state levels is still suffering. That is evident, especially in states like Telangana. So I would definitely like to highlight that there has been raised prize money for athletes with disabilities. There are the Sports Authority of India is improving its priority areas and with more participation from disability sport organizations. There is emphasis on sports, yoga, physical education, and other indigenous sports. That is also an improvement we have seen compared to the previous decades. And increased discourse from the PMO's level in public addresses, or to even address that there is this whole concept of sports for people with disabilities, whether it was a bureaucratic level decision or whether it is coming from the PMO, that definitely is having an impact at the grassroots. When a prime minister or a prime minister's office is talking about sports and for people with disabilities, or adventures of somebody going up a glacier, amputees going up glaciers with special forces, these kinds of stuff have definitely made an impact at the community levels in India. So that can definitely be highlighted as the achievement so far in the policy too, so that becomes a source of information, trusted source of information. So this also needs to be along with the detailed literature review that needs to be improved in the introduction part. These kinds of assurances from the government also need to be detailed in a more elegant manner. And then what are the ground realities? The government's intention at the top to do this is very well placed. But I think it is something like one of the psychologists had told me one time, it is the intention versus the impact. The intention of the government to introduce these kinds of initiatives is great, but the impact of them is not that brilliant at the ground realities, because the union is making decisions, but the union is not mandating. I know it can't be autocratic, but when it comes to matters like disability rights, I think the government must go the extra mile to create those consultations with the state governments to mandate implementation of human rights with regards to persons with disabilities. And I think that is absolutely essential, that they build those bridges, that the central government, like the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports and the Ministry of Social Justice Empowerment, must form a high-level committee to bring in interstate collaborations, at least create regional regional consortiums where these topics can be continued with the help of the DPOs as involving stakeholders. And so that is where I would like to talk about the ground realities. The ground reality is that there is a critical lack of government oversight on how the disability sport NSFs are functioning. The NSFs that have been given the responsibility to promote disability sport do not have the subject matter expertise, and the government up on it. So I think as a person researching in the space, it's my earnest request for the government to focus on developing better government oversight procedures. And then there is a lack of recruitment of subject matter experts. I'm not trying to self-promote myself, but if there are professionals like me, why are we not getting involved in the process? This is not about engaging us as a permanent employee of the government, but we might as well be volunteering for the country. Why are we not a part of the dialogue when we are visible in the system? Why aren't we being asked to engage in the process? Why is still it not a detailed attention to detail kind of approach, you know? And then there is a disconnect between the role and responsibility of the state and union bodies. For example, when a sport organization is being given a disability sport NSF status, the union government is not asking this organization for accountability of what it is doing at the state levels. So that is essential. I think I think there is a need for the union or the central government to create that pathway of accountability. If you're giving somebody a national status, somebody at the grassroots is trusting that organization because of the government stamp. So we want better pathways of the central government holding the state bodies for accountability. That is one of the requirements from the community. And then there is an unavailability of technical expertise at the last mile locations, where most of the athletes with disabilities enter the system in India. At the district and the state levels, at the district or the mandal levels, there is no availability of experts. So disabled people are suffering, struggling injuries. They are making it by trial and error to the national level. I think as lawful citizens of this country, it is their right to be provided that amenity of having that expertise available to them at the district and the mandal levels. So the central government must also make a plan for that and provide an explanation in the policy of what the available resources for that are, or how they intend to address this gap or bridge this gap. Then moving on to what is the way forward? Like I was addressing earlier in this conversation, we have to develop a consortium of state governments that to mandate the policy implementation. So that must be put in writing in the policy. And then there must an engineering of an interministerial collaboration between MIAS and MSJE must happen, because when it comes to disability sporting rights, we don't belong anywhere. As disabled people, we are not belonging to the sports ministry. When it comes to livelihood, employment, job reservations, we are getting the medals, they're coming back, and then at the state level, the policy is not very clear. So I think there is a need to engineer an interministerial collaboration. Then there is a need to improve representation of the stakeholders on the committee. So this is my earnest request to the government. Can you please ensure that we have a body of experts when these committees are put together? You know, not what we have been doing for decades now. Like we have to upgrade ourselves to what is done internationally. So that's my request to the government. And then definitely engage subject matter experts. Without subject matter experts, we will definitely be leaving these gaps open, and we'll have policy that will not be very effective at from a global perspective. So those are my recommendations when it comes, and this is my contact details if somebody needs to further talk to me on these matters. And I'm now open for questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I have one question on behalf of GNLU. What does this policy say about the training of professionals in the field of sports and disability, especially with regard to there was a draft University of Disability Studies and Rehabilitation Sciences Bill in 2021, which has yet not been passed. So, how do we really provide an impetus to the training of, first of all, identifying talent among persons with disability, and then providing them with adequate training and support?
That's a great question. So again, when we bring in the training and preparation of personnel into the picture, even at the RPWD level, there is no clarity, because there has been, I think, a sentence in the education section somewhere where they talk about restructuring courses. Again, the nodal agencies which are going to be responsible for this task are not explicitly listed in the Act. So, and additional to the draft bill you were talking about, we also have a national sports university, in Manipur, and I am wondering, because when that university was set up, also there was a whole disability sport vertical under which there was a proposal for courses. So we are currently having no clarity on how these bills are being introduced, whether these are a product of a group of individuals or organizations which are pursuing it. So I think more transparency on how these bills are being introduced, or for what purpose, because with the National Sports National Sports University law, we have an act, National Sports University Act. When a National Sports University Act is in place, what is the need for us to have a separate bill, which is also again going to talk about this preparation and all? So what is the need is, I'm just talking directly to the law community or the people who are already working on that draft, is it possible for us to bring together the existing legislation or the drafts together, the National Sports University Act, this draft bill, the National Sports Development Code, the Good Governance Code in 2017 that has met with resistance from IOA and other NSFs. Is it possible for us to bring all of that together, sit and deliberate to come up with what is the need of the hour? There is no market survey out there from all the states and union territories where consultations have been sought from the stakeholders to ask what exactly do you need training. We are bringing up these bills and acts, but at the grassroots, nobody is asking these coaches and sports or physical education teachers, what is your requirement? What is the knowledge gap you're having with regards to working with people with disabilities or specialized sports? We are still a very cricket country, which caught up a little bit with badminton, but at the grassroots level, beyond cricket and badminton, we are not doing anything. Athletics suffers hugely despite all the accomplishments and the hard work of the AFI. So there is a need for revisiting as a group. There needs to be a regrouping happening, and that is when we can come identify and say these are the areas in which the training is required. So even I have not come across that bill. I'm actually surprised you have said there is a draft bill out there. So maybe if I would look at that, I might be able to come up with a comprehensive comment or a 2-pager on the matter. Thank you.
Right, ma'am. Thank you. There's one question from Mr. Andab Kumar Bhattacharya. He says, do you feel there is enough awareness on sports as a good career option for young people with disabilities? And is the availability of infrastructure or guidelines for identification of talents and scientific training available at the grassroots level?
To answer the first question, that information is basically being available through the media right now. So if an individual sitting at the grassroots in India wants to get the information, even within NSF websites, if you visit any of the 4 disability sport NSF websites, you don't get comprehensive information. I think the latest organization that got approval, the CPSFI, which is a Cerebral Palsy Sport Federation of India, they have a pretty comprehensive website which provides them resources for individuals with cerebral palsy. But most of the others also, the information is very basic. It does not really give them a pathway type of information. Then the second part, what was the second question you asked, Anand? The second part of the question.
Ma'am, it was regarding the availability of infrastructure and guidelines for identification of talent and scientific training at the grassroots level.
Yeah, that basically, again, the National Sports Development Code places the responsibility for this on the national sport federations. So the national code is saying the NSFs must do this, but no, there are no specific guidelines. The National Sports Development Code is still the go-to guide. Infrastructure is critically lacking. We still don't have infrastructure even in the metros where people with disabilities can go and pursue active training opportunities. So there's all those gaps to fill. So I can only hope the government can consider these comments and like revisit the chapter 8 to provide more detailed pathways, so that the persons with disabilities can have trusted information source in the form of this policy document.
We just have one last question from Sudhanshu Bisht, who is asking, if a person is deaf and the sport he plays has nothing to do with deafness, is he classified as physically fit? If no, then why so?
See, I think this is again a very individual question. When a person has a disability, that is where the rights-based approach comes into the picture. I have a disability, but I must, as an individual, be empowered by my state or by my country to make the individual choice to pick the kind of sport I want to play. So this has got nothing to do with us determining as either subject matter experts or as coaches what an individual wants to perceive about themselves or practice in their life. There is the question slightly, I think he was trying to ask whether a deaf sport, and I'm not going to assume what he wanted to ask, but I think he's saying if a person is deaf and the sport he plays has nothing to do with deafness. Let me just clarify something. When you talk of deaf sports, this is a deaf individual who's pursuing a sport. The specialty of deaf sports is they are sports for people who are deaf, because there are certain adaptations that need to be made in the way the sport is organized. Largely beyond that, the adaptation of that sport is not as intense as it is as the rules would modify or as the equipment would modify, as in with physical disabled people or other people with blindness. So the question can't be like, if a person has deafness and they're going to play a sport, is he physically fit? That is a very disconnected question. Yeah, like javelin has got nothing to do with deafness. Most of the deaf sports, the deafness is coming into consideration when it comes to their interaction, even with any disability for that matter, their interaction with the system that is organizing that sport. So we can't say in the kind of philosophy that promotes disability sport, whether it is coming from the global context also, a person with any level of disability can pursue sport. That is a philosophy where practitioners like me come from, or people like me come from. So that we can't ask that question. I got your question, Sudhanshu, but what I'm saying is, if there is an auditory cue involved in the beginning of a competition, that is where the deafness comes into the picture. So that is where the adaptations are made when it comes to deaf sport. Otherwise, I know a lot of deaf Indians who compete with non-disabled peers at the district and the state levels. I know people who have competed at the national levels too. So it's a very common practice. That is one of the common thing about sport, deaf individuals and hearing people, that needs to be researched more in this country, because that happens far more often than people can imagine.
Padmini ma'am, may I intervene ma'am? I have a connected argument rather question here.
Okay.
If you ma'am, if you look at the rules as far as deaf sports or deaf games are concerned, it is as par with abled body people games, right? There is not much change other than the referees as well as some kind of mocking or some kind of announcement, right?
Announcement, auditory announcement.
Yes, auditory. Yes.
Major, yes.
Because otherwise, even they have the T20 and everything, the rules as par with able body, right?
Yes. Okay. See, what one needs to understand, sir, is that disability sport in general, yes. In India, I think where we are as a country, our learning curve is a little steep on this. we must understand that when it comes to disability sport, oftentimes it is not just about the sport, it is the
Yes.
entire
Yeah.
confederate systems that enable the person with disability to get out and experience the sport. So even though it is not very complicated, deaf sports is so much more complicated in the way it needs to be organized. So it's a more of a disability rights matter
Yes,
than a
yes.
sports rights
Yes,
matter.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for the session, ma'am, and for addressing all our questions in detail.
Anand, one more thing.
Yes, sir.
Actually, even
Yes, sir.
Padma ma'am, one more thing we would like to highlight, especially we are talking about prize money, right? If you look at prior to 2016, there was no such equal prize money. Then 2016 on 16 onwards, earlier they have actually increased the prize money for Paralympians. Then slowly they start recognizing the deaf Olympians and given the prize money to deaf Olympians. Then later they included blind. At least from 2021 notification, if you see that the prize money actually increased.
See, at the
as par with able bodies.
Yeah, here I would like to highlight one thing for any government official who would come across the transcript of this discussion, at least. At the central level, those policies have been implemented or have been announced and have been put in practice since 2016. But one must really understand that India is made up of states that are forming the union. So when an individual is becoming a state citizen after that achievement, they are coming back to reside in their states. That information, that access to infrastructure and resources is not that open. Not every state is adopting the central policy. So that is where I'm saying, if this policy can be written more in a more comprehensive manner, I think it will really help the states also pick up that policy. That way, they're not dealing with the double threat of having to deal with the union red tape and also the state red tape. So that connection, I think I would request the union government to facilitate that connection with each state. We can only hope that that's
that we will recommend also.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the session, ma'am. I now invite Dr. Marisport sir to take the next session. Sir is an assistant professor of law at GNLU Gandhinagar and is the head of the GNLU Center for Disability Studies. His areas of interest are disability rights law, alternative dispute resolution, and criminology. Sir has authored multiple influential research works and was the primary investigator on a government of Gujarat funded project on the work environment of employees with disability.
Thank you, Anand.
Thank you,
yes. So actually, I have a very shorter time because we have one more eminent speaker, actually the Rahul Bajaj. So what I do, certain points I would like to highlight in the disability policy, draft disability policy 2022. Majorly, I will be focusing on healthcare and social securities, and then another some general comments. When we are looking at disability related legislation, either be draft legislation or some kind of policy or some kind of guidelines, we often see some kind of drafting errors. As a law student or as a lawyer, I actually looking at those drafting errors, how it is happening and why it is happening. So here, the biggest issue is that the consultation. If you look at the consultation, generally they take the consent, or they will consider the stakeholders or include the stakeholders and frame the policy and give it for some kind of consideration. But here it is not the thing happening. Actually, what happens? Somebody actually framed the policy, or somebody made the rules or made the legislative framework, then give it for observation. So that's where something actually missing or something actually added in a different perspective. Here, as far as this policy is concerned, some terminologies with regard to psychosocial disabilities. In the RPWD Act, yes, it has been given in a holistic manner. Psychosocial disabilities actually given, even they have been actually considered as intellectual disabilities. This policy could have deployed that terms only, either intellectual disabilities or psychosocial disabilities or both. But it has used some different terminologies, which are kind of negative stereotyping. It could have been avoided. So this is one suggestion I would like to highlight as far as this policy is concerned. Second, with regard to training and with regard to awareness, as far as healthcare is concerned, I would like to again draw your attention. Very recently, Union government has circulated a draft guidelines on healthcare, disability and healthcare. So there are some guidelines have been made which supposed to be followed by private as well as government hospitals. When we look at that guidelines also, there are some drafting errors and certain points actually missing. Even if you look at this draft national policy, again, certain aspects they have included, certain they have excluded. The first positive aspect I would like to highlight, separate model supposed to be included to the doctors about disabilities. That's welcome move. That's wonderful move, and with they have included even similarly engineering students, especially civil engineers and electrical engineers, they should know the requirement of disabilities and universal design model. So that's welcome move. Second, if you look at it, a certain framework they laid on, okay, how this healthcare is supposed to be made available and accessible to the persons with disabilities. They have to. However, when we look at the reality, though we have disaster management rules or how to handle persons with disabilities during emergency in the year 2019 itself, we all were experienced how we have been treated and how we have suffered during COVID. So it shows how it has been implemented. So there should be a clear-cut framework which is a realistic as at the same time implementable framework for healthcare sector also. Here, unlike other sectors, healthcare sectors you can't completely generalize because each person with disabilities have some kind of requirement for different set of healthcare, and in fact there are some disabilities, the persons with disabilities who have blood related disorders, so they require some frequent visit and frequent monitor of hospitals and doctors. So how they have been treated, even as people with autism spectrum disorders, so they require complete monitor. So these specific issues supposed to be taken into account while framing the policies. This is, I feel, supposed to be there in the policies. Second, I would like to touch upon the social security scheme. Here, whenever we are talking about social security, it has connection with all other areas, be it education or be it employment or be it healthcare. So it connected with social security, which I feel. Many of the times we look at the social security policies which always connected with pensions. Of course, pension is a negative connotation, I feel, because that generally pension given when somebody retired. But as far as disabilities, it's not a kind of retirement, right? So it's a kind of compensation, I would feel. So if you look at that pensions related aspect or compensation related aspect, there are different states are giving different set of amounts. Some states are giving 300, some states are giving 1200, some states are giving 3000. We should have uniform amount and which must be higher as far as persons with disabilities are concerned. There are different level of social security compensation given during education, or sometimes post higher studies, or sometimes persons with disabilities who are elders and who are in high support needs. So different levels they are getting. And sometimes what happened, some of the facilities actually they are getting some kind of subsidies for purchasing their aids, physical aids, or some kind of accessible devices, they are purchasing accessible devices, they are getting some support, but not all. Some people will get support. Again, the beauty of these kind of social securities, even some kind of marriage allowance also they are getting, but the beauty of these allowances, I'm putting it in a different way. If somebody is getting one allowance, he may not entitled to get other allowance. And even if at all that person is getting, it is too tough to get and apply and get it and everything, right? Even during the COVID also, some states progressively given the COVID allowance to persons with disabilities on their doorstep, but many of the persons with disabilities who are in need of that allowance hadn't got that allowance. So that's a reality. So this should have been taken care by the government. And second thing, the allocation of fund, especially social securities and healthcare. At least this policy might have specified. Of course, Muralidharan sir highlighted this policy doesn't talk about target and other things. But at least in healthcare sector, there should be a target and there should be a kind of monetary mechanism. And even this training is not about one day affair. It should be a continuous training. And many of the times what happened, many of the persons with disabilities who are living in rural areas, and they are in need of some supportive hand for their health emergencies, otherwise also. So even especially women with disabilities, they are in need of these primary healthcare centers. So in such a cases, they must be sensitized, they must be given training. Though it's mentioned in the product, but how it is going to be implemented. This is very, very important. And whenever we are talking about healthcare, it's not only about availability, it is supposed to be accessible. What if I am allowed to get into one hospital where in which the hospital documents are not accessible? Whatever the doctor is saying, I am not able to understand. Then what's the point in getting that right? I simply treated, but my right to know is completely neglected, completely abandoned. How I will come to know that? So please remember, right to be informed is very, very important right to a consumer, as well as to the persons with disability as a consumer who is availing the healthcare service. But what is happening here? The accessibility of those information is actually lacking. As a visually impaired, if you are giving the document in a printed form, how I will access? Why don't you give it in an accessible, readable format? In the soft copy, that's possible. So that's similarly, even otherwise you can communicate properly and treating them. So those things supposed to be clearly mentioned. In fact, one more interesting thing, that draft guidelines also on healthcare also highlighted, even this policy also highlighted, it is applicable to government as well as private hospital. But what could be the framework for making accessible to the existing infrastructure, healthcare sector? How we will make accessible? Is there any mechanism? Even existing infrastructure, it is too tough to alter unless there is a funding. So how it would be achieved? There is no clarity in this policy. So I suggest there should be some framework or supportive framework for making existing and health infrastructure accessible. Right. This is from my end with regard to healthcare and social security and in the general observation of these policies. Otherwise, we have to look at some more other angle, that consultation process. Many of the times we have been given short time. Even this healthcare related guidelines also very short time. Even that the Disability University Bill, which Anand actually highlighted, very short time. But that should not be the case. Whenever you are making the policy, that itself shows, whenever you are making the policy, and this is a policy you are making for a sensitive group. So if that is the case, made it available as well as accessible way to all persons with disabilities, be it deaf, be it visually impaired, or be it autism spectrum disorder. Everybody is supposed to be involved in the consultation process. This is my last view, and I would like to stop here. If there is any comments, question, I will take. Otherwise, over to you, Anand.
Thank you so much, sir. We have one question from Mr. Arnab Kumar Bhattacharya. He says that people having no disability can adjust and prepare themselves when an emergency situation arises. In case of emergency situation, is there any specific guideline to communicate with persons with disabilities in an accessible format? For example, everyone is using face mask for safety purpose, but deaf person like me could not follow lip reading or request the person to remove mask for the conversation in daily life. So what would be your thoughts on this practical consideration?
Yes. Actually, I completely understand. In fact, this is what happened during COVID situation. The Disaster Management Act clearly mandated that the disaster management authorities, whosoever involved, they have to be sensitized towards dealing with persons with disabilities. This is very much clear. In fact, they have framed the rules, but they haven't followed. How the police officers treated with deaf people. There were some instances in which deaf people were actually literally tried by the police, and some deaf people actually suffered due to non-availability of their interpreters. So it happened. But please remember, already we have kind of guidelines, but the implementation is lacking. So that's where I actually urge this policy is supposed to have a roadmap. Who are all the stakeholders? It should be communicated. And who are the stakeholders? The training is supposed to be given, so that the persons with disabilities during emergency as well as non-emergency situation, they could access their healthcare services and avail the healthcare services as par with abled people. Okay. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, sir. We have actually some questions which were posted on our YouTube live stream. So Mr. Alok Kushwaha is asking.
Do one thing. Actually, already Rahul sir has joined. Rahul Bajaj has joined. Hello,
Yes, sir.
Rahul. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here, sir.
Yeah. So we can take his views. So
Sure,
then we can continue with the question and answer session.
Sure, sir. I'll just introduce him in a minute, and we'll start with Rahul sir's session.
Yeah, please.
So thank you very much, sir, for your address. We start with our next session for this webinar. We are joined by Mr. Rahul Bajaj, sir, who is a senior resident fellow partnerships in the research director's office at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy.
Not right now. I have recently this week I've joined as an attorney at IRA Law in
Sure,
Delhi.
sir.
So my
Yes,
designation has changed. I am a senior associate fellow at Vidhi, though I still work with them on a part-time basis.
Right. So I apologize for the oversight.
No problem. You have
Right, sir. Rahul sir works on developing grassroots networks and collaborative partnerships with the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. He studied law at the University of Nagpur, graduating as the gold medalist at the university. After working at Trilegal Delhi disputes practice for a year, he pursued his postgraduate legal education at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. On returning to India, he clerked for Supreme Court Judge Justice D.Y. Chandrachud before joining Vidhi. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation, and I request to please start your session.
Thanks very much, and thank you to GNLU for inviting me to speak on the draft National Disability Policy today. It is an extremely important chapter in the disability rights movement in India, uh, the previous policy indicates that the longevity of the previous policy indicates that the current one is also likely to have a long shelf life of about 15 to 20 years. And therefore, it is critical that we make sure that it is as robust as possible. I'm going to be speaking on two subjects within the policy: accessibility and education. Uh, and what I'm going to do is first briefly summarize what the policy has to say on these two topics, and then give some thoughts on where I think the policy falls short and how it could be better. First, I will talk about accessibility. The policy begins chapter 9 by talking about the definition of accessibility in terms of making every product or service accessible to everyone. And it outlines the three strands of accessibility, which are physical accessibility, transport accessibility, and information and communication technology accessibility. It provides an overview of attempts to embed accessibility into our laws and policies, and particularly focuses on the Persons with Disabilities Act of 1995. What I found helpful and a positive thing was that it actually provides quite a realistic assessment of the 1995 Act, in that it says that the Act did not contain any clear timelines or require the formulation of any standards for determining what is and is not accessible. But it does say that the 95 Act covered things like ramps, having braille and auditory signals in lifts, having accessible healthcare in a limited sense, and having accessible and transport systems. It then moves on to talking about Article 9 of the UN CRPD and India's commitments pursuant to Article 9. And there are 7 main takeaways as far as that article is concerned. Can you still hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay, great. So there are 7 main takeaways from Article 9 of the UN CRPD that it talks about relevant to the policy at hand. In the sense that it talks about covering those 3 strands of accessibility: the thrust on monitoring and compliance, the importance of training relevant stakeholders to embed the importance of accessibility. These are some of the key features of Article 9 that it focuses on. Then it talks about the Accessible India campaign, which the DEPWD started in December 2015. And 3 strands of that, which are consonant with, which are in conformity with the UNCRPD, and sort of the threefold categorization of accessibility that the policy begins by talking about in chapter 9. Now, I'd like to read out paragraph 9.9, which is quite critical. It says, and I'm going to read it out here: the RPWD Act 2016 mandates the government to frame accessibility norms in respect of built-up environment, into bracket public buildings, transportation systems, ICT ecosystem, and other facilities and services. Further, the government is also required to take measures to provide accessibility features at bus stops, railway stations, airports, and also ensure accessible roads to address mobility necessary for PWDs. It also mandates the government to take measures to ensure that all content available in audio, print, and electronic media and electronic and consumer goods are available in universal design. Then paragraph 9.12 of the policy contains as many as 18 areas of intervention when it comes to realizing accessibility. I'll just point out some of them. It says that local building bylaws should embed accessibility standards. It says that the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, at the time of granting security clearance to any website, is to assess its accessibility in accordance with the Government of India guidelines on web accessibility. It says that all mobile apps that are relevant for the public at large should comply with relevant accessibility standards. And this is something that I work a great deal on currently in terms of advocacy and assisting service providers. It also says that the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting is to frame standards for audio description and sign language interpretation. Now, here are a few questions that I think the policy, here are a few thoughts in terms of what the policy, what I make of the policy. First is that and you will see that a lot of the thoughts that I have are similar for education and accessibility, because I have similar concerns under both heads. First is that the policy does not clarify within how much time the measures that it outlines are to be taken. It also does not lay out a mechanism for capacity building and monitor in terms of ensuring that relevant stakeholders are well equipped to actually do what it asks them to do, and it does not have a monitoring mechanism to ensure that what it contains is actually done. The final point I would like to make here is that it does not deal with the turf wars that often exist between ministries in the area of accessibility. And this is something that I have realized when trying to push for reforms in the area of digital accessibility. Because the DPWD says that digital stuff falls within the remit of the MeitY, and the MeitY says that everything to do with accessibility falls within the remit of the DPWD. So they keep batting the ball from one to the other, which results in things not moving forward. That is as far as accessibility is concerned. I'll now move on to education. So the chapter on education begins by emphasizing that education is critical for improving life prospects for children with disabilities and is a key means of socialization for them. It also points to the worrying statistic that the literacy rate generally in India is 74%, but for children with disabilities, it is only 55%. It then traces the evolution of schemes on education that have been framed since the 1970s by different governments at the center. And in particular talks about the PWD Act of 1995 and the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan from 2001. It talks about that Abhiyan's focus on a no rejection policy, ensuring that every child is carried forward, is given admission and they're not denied access to education on the basis of their disability. It then focuses on Article 24 of the UNCRPD, which is extremely crucial. But there are two important points that flow from Article 24. One is the inclusion of children with disabilities in the general education system. And I want to acknowledge that this is not uncontested territory. Some people, this is something that people have different views about, and I will come to why it may not always be a good idea to simply push for inclusive education. And the second is reasonable accommodation within the educational system. And in some sense, the two go together, because until you have reasonable accommodation, you can't include children with disabilities in the mainstream educational system. It then talks about provisions in the RPWD Act that relate to education. Section 16 and 17 in this regard are particularly crucial, and I'll highlight a few provisions. One is that it says the Act says that no child is to be denied admission because of their disability and to be discriminated against on that basis. Secondly, it talks about barrier-free access to the campus, to libraries, and to all educational facilities. Thirdly, it talks about communicating educational content to children with disabilities in accessible methods and modes. And another example is that it says that they are to be provided access to transport, including their attendance in appropriate cases. Then it talks about the National Education Policy of 2020. That policy talks about how children are not to be denied access to education based on their birth or background. It talks about creating an enabling mechanism for children with special needs. And it says that they should be given training across the board, like not days, not the children, but the relevant stakeholders responsible for imparting education to children with disabilities should be trained across the board so that they are able to provide appropriate support. Now, I want to read a particular excerpt from the chapter, which I thought was quite crucial. It says, with the coming into effect of new National Education Policy and RPWD Act 2016, there is a need to take affirmative actions accordingly to foster inclusive education. This policy aims at giving chance to every child with a disability and to leave no and to nahi bola hai usne, usne direct bola and leave no child with a disability behind. It then lays out 17 areas of intervention for promoting educational access. For example, it says that every school, every state or UT has to make sure that when it grants clearance to a school, it ensures that their school is complying with the RPWD Act. That is the term of the sanction that is granted to them. It says that every district should have a nodal officer oversee the admission of children with disabilities. Thirdly, it says that they should that the progress of children with disabilities should be monitored based on their learning and their learning outcomes. Based on that, their progress should be monitored. For another important thing it talks about is aligning the RPWD Act with the Right to Education Act 2009, which is something that the Supreme Court has also spoken about earlier this year in a judgment by Justice Khanwilkar. Now I'm going to share a few thoughts on the education chapter. One, I did not understand why there is a point that there should be a district nodal officer on education, given that the RPWD rules already talk about the need to have a district nodal educational officer. I think rule 4 or 5, somewhere around that, it talks about that. So this seemed duplicative to me. Second, when it says that, and I'm grateful to Hezzy Smith for pointing this out to me, when it says that the progress of children with disabilities in the educational system is to be monitored based on their learning outcomes. That is only, as Hezzy put it, one side of the coin. The other side is making sure that parents and children with disabilities and their teachers have the support needed to provide good learning outcomes for children with disabilities. So an ex post facto assessment of children with disabilities after their learning outcomes have been attained may not help the children of today. All it can do perhaps is to help the children of tomorrow. Because for those of today, what they need is more in the moment support when they are being educated and not an ex post facto assessment of outcomes that have already been reached. The third important point is much like all other chapters in the policy, this one also, when it says these 17 contains these 17 points, it is just a wish list of aspirations that the policy lays out, which they are in the nature of campaign promises. It's more rhetoric than reality in the sense that it doesn't actually point out, it doesn't contain any measurable targets. For example, it doesn't say that, okay, look, we are going to make this platform, the Diksha platform, accessible within 6 months from the date of which on which this policy comes into force. It does not say that we are going to require at least 8 states, ask at least, require to nahi kar sakte, but we are going to ask at least 8 states to enact laws that make non-discrimination against the disabled part of the clearance process when approving a school, that we are going to change the RTE Act to bring it in alignment with the RPWD Act within 1 year. There are no measurable targets. So 5-10 years later, if I am to pick up this policy and see whether or not it has worked, it will be very difficult for me to do that because I won't have any milestones or touchstones laid out in the policy against which to measure its progress. There isn't, not only are there no measurable targets, there is also no monitoring mechanism to have people who can actually see whether every stakeholder is doing what they are supposed to do under the policy. A small quibble that I had with the 17th point in the chapter on education, which lays out these measures, is that it says that the Ministry of Education is to prescribe standards on closed captioning and subtitling for educational content. There it should also cover audio description for people who are visually challenged. That it does not do. It says that disability specific curriculum should be developed in every, for children with disabilities. This is again a point that Hezi made in my conversation with him. I'm grateful to him for bringing it up. Instead, it should talk about individualized curriculum for children with disabilities. There can't be a disability specific curriculum that, okay, all children who are blind will be given education in this way. Instead, in the US, now of course, I know that this is also not always the best solution, but they have what are called individualized educational programs, where if you are putting a disabled child into a mainstream school environment, you can't just lump them with with able-bodied children and expect them to perform. You have to have an individualized curriculum that is designed as per their abilities and needs. So that should be the focus rather than having a disability-based curriculum. So these are some broad thoughts that I have about the policy. I'm happy to talk more in terms of developing any of the points that I have shared here further. And I look forward to hearing your views also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We have a couple of questions from our YouTube live stream as well as the chat box. So the
Yes.
Youth Service Center says that is the policy elaborating on any mechanism of accessibility audit and self-compliance mechanism?
No, nothing that I saw on this point. It only talks about the MAIT checking for accessibility when granting clearances, but nowhere does it talk about accessibility audits or self-certification or anything of that sort.
Right, sir. And we had a couple of general questions which were asked earlier.
Yes.
For example, Mr. Sunil Suthar says, as a person in the I'm sorry, as there is a legal provision for persons with disability, but the implementation is severely lacking to get benefits from private industry executives or institutes, universities, and other employers. So how does an employee with disability or a student negotiate with such authorities?
I think what needs to happen is they need to reach out to other people who've done whatever it is that they are trying to do, and therefore they have the know-how to figure out how a particular situation can be tackled by a person with a disability, and reach out to other people with disabilities who can push for them, who can advocate for them, and able-bodied people. They need allies in that particular institution who can work with them to assert their needs and to ensure that they have an enabling ecosystem. I'm happy to speak more with this person, with Mr. Sunil, and see how I may be able to help the people he talks about. If there are particular cases that can be taken up in an appropriate way, either legally or elsewhere, I'm very happy to explore the possibility of doing that. So please feel free to ask Mr. Marisport for my email address or phone number, and I'd be happy to talk to you.
Thank you so much, sir. Shampa ma'am, your comments on this question, if so, that would be beneficial for a wider discussion as well.
Sorry, can you tell me the question?
Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. It mainly related to the aspect of employees with disability and the private employers, institutes, universities, etc., where such employees and students may not get their full rights and accessibility initiatives. So, how does first of all the practical considerations? How can a person with disability face them, and what can the draft do to facilitate these measures?
There are, of course, I mean, the private institutes, even the colleges and employment at any institute. Uh, first of all, is there are some corporates or big offices who are taking up diversity as a issue for them, and they're trying to include some kind of uh, diversity in their work. It's not that I'll not say that it's a big zero in the sense that since I have been working, like I said, I had been working for 30 years in this sector. I can see that there is a change. There is a bit more awareness, bit more uh, initiative to bring in diverse people in workforce and colleges in universities like that. But it's of course, since it is not a mandatory thing for them, it becomes a very like ad hoc thing. Some institute are taking up issues on their own, and it all depends on like people who are there in the particularly in a senior positions. But inclusion is a philosophy. So if a person doesn't believe in inclusion, it's very difficult to make it happen. So I mean, if it doesn't believe in inclusion, the authorities doesn't believe in inclusion, you have to make it mandatory. And in our law, it is not mandatory for private institutions to employ. I mean, the percentage, the reservation is not mandatory. Of course, this policy can. We have high hopes from any single initiative that the government takes because there is so little work happening in this whole sector. So, uh, people like us, we do work with individual organizations, individual institutes, individual universities, trying to help people, trying to help disabled students to get their rights. But as I said, it becomes very ad hoc kind of thing. So if this policy says that, but we have UGC rules that every institute should, every college should have a disability cell, and so it's not that how to express this now. I don't think it's a lack of law or policies. It's more, I think, as a country, we do not sort of work on. We do not believe in inclusion in general. So it's more like we also have to make the disability issue more visible. We have to take it beyond ramp. Like you just make a ramp and you call it like, okay, we are disabled friendly. That is not doable. Particularly colleges and universities need to think of diverse kind of needs of students. It might be audio books, might be braille books, might be a slow learner might need a totally different kind of atmosphere to read. The examination procedures need to be changed sometimes. So So a lot of us are working in one-to-one basis. If it's there in the policy, it's very good. But I personally feel that we can also take help of, there are mandates from the UGC, so we can also check that and see how we can use that, at least at the student level.
Thank you, ma'am. A very interesting question has arisen, I think, in the YouTube chat. I invite any interested resource person to share their views on this. The question is, does this draft policy have any provisions to deal with mitigating the effect of climate change with respect to persons with disability?
In fact, Anand,
Yes, sir.
this policy is silent on various aspects.
Yes, sir.
Okay, climate change and disability is one among them, which I feel.
Yes, sir.
Okay, this policy doesn't actually discuss as per my knowledge course, because I have gone through it. Nowhere it is mentioned. However, whenever any disaster comes, disability are the one most vulnerable. And especially if you again get into the different types of disabilities, depending upon the nature of the disabilities, some disabilities are much vulnerable than other disabilities, especially people who are having mobility issues, people who are in need of some kind of continuous medical observation. So they are the one in the danger zone. But unfortunately, this policy doesn't discuss about climate change related aspects, but indirectly you can take a cue about disaster management. But that's again, that indirect we can have a golden rule of interpretation, but it doesn't suffice as far as persons with disabilities are concerned. There should be a direct, clear-cut plan about climate change and mitigating measures on persons with disabilities, because the preparedness, and especially I'm just giving very recently in some of the part of India faced unexpected heat wave, and that is unseasonal. That time even I myself faced kind of extreme sufferings. Similarly, there are some of my friends, they had they have faced such situation. So there was no such communication. So I feel that there should be some plan, and there should be direct discourse on this, and it should be incorporated in the policy itself, which I feel. And in fact, before I give it to other speaker, I would like to highlight Rahul, especially which is relating to the previous questions about how to deal with non-availability of certain facilities, certain services. He is a good negotiator. At least some way he deal it informal way to negotiate, and he actually do that middle, take the middle way to ensure that certain services are supposed to be done. So you can you can actually do such approaches. In fact, he is involved into making a website and some of the mobile apps accessible, at least certain extent. He is dealing with that. So I request the concerned person, he can even contact Rahul Bajaj, and even you can do such approach also. In fact, there is one book written by a foreign author, I forget. Even Rahul also interviewed that author, and I also used that book in my negotiation class, how to negotiate with regard to the disability related dealings. Even that author also did, based on the experience, she has written that book. I think Rahul could able to further give a glimpse on that.
Thanks very much, Professor, for those words of appreciation. This is Lainey Feingold's book called Structured Negotiation, a Winning Alternative to Lawsuits, where she advocates this approach based on 30 years of advocating for accessibility of digital and physical accessibility in the United States. And along with a couple of other lawyers who are also blind, Amal Jain and Turab Chiptanawala, I am working on constructively engaging with service providers of apps and websites to make them more accessible, to sensitize them about their legal obligations, to provide them access to the technical support that they need to be able to make their platforms more accessible. and should that not yield desired results, opt for litigation.
Thank you, sir. We have one question regarding corporate social responsibility.
If you
As
do
to
just one point, if you do want to reach out with any concerns, please email us at mission-accessibility at googlegroups at gmail.com, and we can take it up.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
sure, sir. Sure, sir.
Anand, before ask others, actually, I would like to hear even Shampa ma'am and Rahul on climate change and disability. What's your take? And especially, you both actually have some kind of primary experience with persons with disabilities. So I would hear. Shampa ma'am, are you there?
Yeah, we actually had a very extensive consultation also on how the importance of including the issue of climate change in this policy. Firstly, the situation is now, I think the expert who was there told us that we don't even talk about climate, we don't even mention the term climate change now, we say climate crisis, because we are in that stage now. So we are in that stage when there is a climate crisis. So, and as we know that as persons with disabilities, we are more vulnerable and we face more difficulties in any kind of it's not only disaster in general. I mean, like you talked about heat waves are not accepted as disaster till now. So and any kind of, but we need to talk about also, I mean, I personally feel that what about mental health, because there are enough literature on how climate change, the climate crisis is affecting our mental health. And so if you think of like even the, I mean, if you look at the Western literature, then there are talks about the farmer suicides due to drought system. But these are the issues even within disability movement we don't talk much about, because I mean itself, I think mental illness, psychosocial disability itself, though it was there even in the 1995, we usually don't talk much about. These are not things we talk more about access in physical access. So, and mental health is something, and there are cases which is affected by climate change. And that is one point. The secondary thing that it makes migration becomes reality for large number of people when the climate change happens. But in, like, since I stay in West Bengal, we know that there are islands which was there even 10 years ago, which is just not there because the sea level is changing. So the total islands are missing now. So, and so people are moving from one place to another. So imagine a person with a disability, and what happens in this kind of scenario? The person with disabilities is actually left behind. The families don't take them also sometimes because they're considered burden. It's very difficult to relocate with adult who's disabled. So, so these are the areas we need to, I think, discuss much more within the sector, that how why it is important to include in the national policy itself, and also amongst ourselves within the sector. This dialogue should uh, get more attention. I mean, that's my personal take.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Shampa ma'am. May I request Rahul sir for your quick word about this? Rahul, can you hear me?
Professor,
Yes.
Mary spoke, this is not something that I am an expert on, so I can only speak to it as a general
Yeah, I know
observer.
general. Yes, yes.
The absence of climate change from the policy is a significant omission. I attended a roundtable moderated a roundtable on the draft policy on Friday at NLS Bangalore. One Mr. Pawan Mantha pointed out this issue of climate change not being covered in the policy. So what Shampa ma'am says is extremely critical, and persons with disabilities, as you are aware, are at greater risk of being adversely impacted by all kinds of crises, and climate crises are no exception. And it is important, and the UNCRPD has provisions on this also,
Yes.
that any disaster management measures adequately account for the needs of persons with disabilities. How we modulate those general provisions which are there in the UNCRPD as well as Section 8 of the RPWD Act, for instance, to meet the challenges posed by climate change is a burning question that we must give intelligent consideration to. And if the way we have dealt as a country with the COVID pandemic for persons with disabilities is any indication, then this is something that does require
Yes.
serious introspection and
Yeah.
consideration.
Thank you, Rahul sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
We just have one small question. If I can request Padmini ma'am to take this up. Uh, with respect to corporate social responsibility and its role in uh, really facilitating sports, education, and in general empowerment of persons with disability. So, Padmini ma'am, if you would want to answer that.
So the question is that what is the role of the corporate social responsibility in promoting sports?
Yes. Yeah. Sports and
Yes,
education.
Yes.
See, that's been happening for quite some time now, if I would say. For a very long time, there's been CSR funds being sent in from PSUs also into sports. But I think that is still, again, not very well regulated or looked into, because there's a lot of, because again, this is a law university program. I would like to put this out there. Nobody is researching and investigating on the conflict of interest element in this. So the CSR fund is coming in. There are avenues to fund grassroots programs more than the top level competitions or the individuals. That is what I would like to put out. CSR funds are essential to promote sports at the grassroots, but still the money is being spent at the competition and the mega event level is what we are witnessing more than to empower community level programs. So that is something I would like to say when it comes to the question about CSR. There is a need for the CSR money givers to know that there is a community level programming aspect that they might want to consider instead of it just being a competition sponsoring kind of a thing, or even an individual sponsoring kind of a thing. Because the elite people are again ending up getting the money, layers and layers of the money, but the grassroots athletes trying to make it to the podium are still suffering with financial crisis. So yeah, the CSR funds are being coming in, but they need to get more. They need to get more organized. They must again be guided by the people who know what's happening at the grassroots, whether it's the DPOs or the people like me and others.
Thank you so much for your response, ma'am. We now come to the end of this webinar. I would first thank all of our very esteemed resource persons for taking out their time to address our participants and really enhancing the discussion by analyzing the draft policy. We thank our respected Director, Sir, Professor Dr. S. Shanta Kumar, Registrar, Sir, Dr. Jagdish Chandra, the Head of Academic Affairs, Dr. Anjani Singh Tomar, the Head of Research and Publication Division, Dr. Viral Pandya, the Shruti Disability Center for facilitating this webinar, the faculty and staff at GNLU Gandhinagar, and most of all, the participants for making this webinar a success. We are especially grateful to the interpreters, Ms. Nitika and Ms. Preeti from ISL, for their time and effort in enhancing the accessibility of this webinar. We are very grateful to them. We hope this discussion and this webinar was a fruitful attempt at analyzing the draft policy and paving a way forward. Thank you very much for joining.
Yes.
And Maris, sir, if you have any
Yes. Actually,
final.
I would like to specially thank Rahul Bajaj in his busy schedule for accepting our invitation. And I'm so much grateful, Shampa ma'am. She actually come forward and told we should have, and we should have the consultation in a way, in a such a way that it should be make the people aware. Then we encourage them to give their comments as well. So this is what her suggestion. Accordingly, we have paid, and special thanks to Padmini ma'am and Muralidharan sir for their immediate acceptance and for their kind support for this event. Without them, we may not have this great session. And hope you to have you all again. And Rahul, we would like to have you again, all in especially this legal consultation on certain draft legislation, even quotes on this particular disability related policies as well as guidelines. So
Yes.
because we need to look on the drafting
Yes,
errors.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thanks very much.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. And all the participants, thanks for your enthusiastic for support. Without you, this event might not have this much success. And we will be sharing the feedback form. In that, we also given the option of giving your comments on this draft national policy. If you are interested, you can please share that comments as well, and we would be compiling all the comments, and we will be sharing it with the ministry, and we ensure that it will reach the ministry. Okay, thank you. Have a nice day, and we will meet you on another occasion. Thank you, and thanks Anand and Harshit.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nitika ma'am and Preeti ma'am. Viewers on YouTube were thanking you a lot for the interpretation. You were live on the YouTube as well.
Harshit, feedback from you have shared, right?
Yes, sir. I have shared the feedback.
And just mention with the participants, it would be available few times, right? That is a few minutes, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I'm taking you leave, Harshit.
Yes.
So can we leave?
Whom is it? Preeti ma'am or Nikita ma'am?
Yeah. So
Yes, ma'am. You may leave, ma'am.
all right. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Sir, I shall close the meeting after 5 minutes since the feedback form is live.
Oh, you close it. What you do? You stop the recording.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, you can leave the meeting, sir. I'll just end the meeting.
Okay. Do